Thank you, Rune. Appreciate the invitation, and glad to see so many people in attendance, both there in the room and virtually. This is a really nice opportunity for me, and goes back to Peter Martelli. Actually, he and I have been collaborating recently, and he said, "Dave, you need to update your profile at CCRM. It hasn't been updated since you retired 5 years ago from the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center, and really you need to contact those folks and get that website, those corrections made." And so that led to the conversation with Rune and this invitation to be speaking with all of you today. It's really a great organization. I've been interested in what CCRM had been able to do in the past, and I've been able to connect with some of you directly over the years, and I'll get into a little bit of that in the history portion of my presentation. High reliability organizing has been something that really has been a labor of love for me, but directly connected to so many of the things that I and my colleagues have been interested in creating reliability, resilience, and ways to help people to be better and better at what they do. I'm going to go ahead and start moving through the slides unless there's some reason to pause right now, Rune. Am I good to go?
You are good to go. Would you prefer questions during your presentation or hold them until the end?
That's always a great question. You know, we can go down a lot of rabbit trails, I'm sure. So if you wouldn't mind just waiting until the end, just make a note of what it is that you were having concern with or having questions about, and we can go into those and maybe have a little bit more of an organized discussion at the end.
That sounds perfect. And I've muted everyone who's on the WebEx. So if you're on the WebEx, we won't be able to hear you until this question and answer time.
Okay, great. The weaving the history portion could get very involved. Got a long list of things here, and I'm not going to just read the slide to you. I'm sure some of us are thankful for people that don't read slides. And then I'll go into the current things that are going on with HRO for me and the others I'm working with, and then hopefully their future collaborations as well. Many of you know me from my work with the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center. This is a center that was created out of a disaster that happened in the wildland fire community where many firefighters, not just rookies, but some of our very best smoke jumpers and hotshots and people that really knew their business were overrun in Colorado in 1994, and the wildland fire community began to ask itself a lot of questions. What is it that we need to learn from this? Why do we need to stop and pause here and reflect on what we've learned so far and what we still need to learn? And we began to invite others outside of the wildland fire community to help us to see and understand ourselves even better. And so there was a very introspective process that took place along with others then that were professionals in this business of examining safety cultures and helping people to see and understand attitudes and belief systems. And they came up with a recommendation that said, you folks need to set up a leadership development program and also one single wildland fire lessons learned center for the nation, and be able to then pull together information and help people to learn and improve. And so we began to be introduced to people like David Garvin, a PhD out of the Harvard Business School, who had worked with learning organizations. And that's what we wanted to become, was a learning organization. And he had written a book called Learning in Action. And this is something that we then began to use, and our relationship with Dr. Garvin began to really develop into workshops and helping the community go beyond what we knew about after-action reviews from our work with the military and began to study other organizations beyond the military into business and all kinds of seemingly unrelated areas to wildland firefighting. While I was in Salt Lake City working with Dr. Garvin on putting on a workshop on after-action reviews, the firestorm in Southern California in 2003 broke out, and I was sent to lead an information collection team with people from the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center and other experts. And we began to discover things in Southern California that other firefighters wished they would have known before they came to Southern California to help fight that firestorm. We interviewed over 115 people in different individual and group situations, and they began to give us a lot of information that matched up with what we then learned in writings by Carl White and Kathleen Sutcliffe, and they were working with us on now putting on Managing the Unexpected workshops. And they introduced me to a person that Carl White calls the mother of HRO, Dr. Carleen Roberts. And they were sitting in a cafe there at the hotel where this conference in Ontario, California was being held in 2004. And they said, well, certainly you know who this is. And I said, no, I'm afraid I don't. And so they told me about her and her work with high reliability organizing and how that phrase became known and how she worked with many different organizations, aircraft carriers and aircraft control towers and medical facilities, and began to explore the many ways that a few stood out above and beyond other organizations within the same genre and be able to see what it was that made them different. At that same conference, I was introduced to the other member in the room there, Renaud Vidal, that was at the time a PhD student interested in incident management teams working on crisis management, particularly in wildland firefighting. And I began to discuss these things with people like Renaud, and it connected for me back to my previous experience in the U.S. Air Force. I ran a place called the Zulu Alert Facility, where we had F-15s on 5-minute alert and another one on backup, 15-minute backup, where they were loaded with these missiles that you see here by that aircraft, heat-seeking and radar-guided missiles. And we began to implement a lot of the things that we thought would really help us to learn and improve. And as a result, we ended up winning the Hughes Trophy for managerial excellence for that squadron, the 32nd Attack Fighter Squadron, not only once, but twice, 2 years in a row in 79 and 80, which was unprecedented in the history of that trophy. Now it's called the Raytheon Trophy. We began to see that Carleen and others that she worked with were putting together information on HROs that they were doing that helped them to be better and continually improve. They designed their systems to be working well for them, and then also they focused on communications and helping people to have consistent dialogue, helping people to feel safe, to speak up, and be able to be even rewarded for speaking up when they felt like something's just not right here. I don't even know exactly what it is, but I got this feeling on the back of my neck that says we need to take a tactical pause here and understand what's really happening, not just what we hope is happening or believe is happening. We began to use the book, Managing the Unexpected, written by Carl and Kathleen, to help us to teach principles, processes of high reliability organizing at the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center, and also through the institute that that place, that center was operating out of. to incident management teams, candidates for national and regional incident management team positions. And these seemingly simple things began to generate discussion and dialogue among these folks. They began to recognize what they were already doing, but then began to see where they could improve and where they were confused. They're saying, I'm not sure what I really think about managing capabilities for resilience, for instance, or what about the big failures? You talked about tracking small failures. We've been tracking just the big accidents. What do you mean by small failures? And we began to look for anomalies and things that just were out of place and were stacking up. And we began to identify those things before they became big problems and much harder to solve. I mentioned Renault. One of the high spots in my career with HRO was working with Renault on bringing American and French incident management teams together in simulated events in southern France, in a center that had been created for working with incident management teams, evaluating them, helping them to learn and improve as individuals, but then also as teams, and helping them to see that things were really different between different cultures. They were fighting the same problems, but doing things in a very different way oftentimes, and they began to learn from one another. You can see that this is something that was sponsored by Berkeley and CCRM, and it's on your website. So take a look at that. There's a lot of great information there. The place that this happened at in southern France, near Aix-en-Provence, is a building that had been retrofitted to bring in things like on the left-hand side, a station where somebody driving a truck would be able to work with radio communications only and be able to then connect to people that were flying airplanes and helicopters and people that were then organizing events in ways to manage crisis situations. It was just a thing of beauty because people were saying, wow, this is what we need. And even Tom Harbour, the leader of the U.S. Forest Service Fire and Aviation Management Program at the time, said, well, we spend $50 million on a piece of software that helps us to bring resources to bear on these incidents. But if we spend $1 million to retrofit a building to fit this model, we would really be moving forward in a significant direction, not only as individuals, but as teams, and be able to collect information like Renault did, not only on recording what happened, but a lot of the things that people were experiencing in the way of heart rate and blood pressure and all kinds of biological data as well. And be able to see as people, as they spoke, their voices were raising or lowering and how tempo of things were changing. It turned into a mountain of data for Renault. And I encourage you to take a look at his PhD dissertation. He's been recognized as someone that is really exceptional by French researchers. Renault, I know I'm putting you on the spot, but you need to be recognized for all of the good work that you've done. We began to hear from people in the wildland fire community, and this slide actually is a drawing that was given to us at the Lessons Learned Center by a firefighter who said, I need to be able to turn around and explain these things to my boss, because he wasn't there at your presentation. And so he said, if we build upon at the base here what we are learning in the leadership programs, respectful interaction, trust, honesty, and self-respect are a great foundation to build these other structures on and begin to look at becoming a learning culture, as James Reason has described it with its subcultures and written about in Carl and Kathleen's book, where people are able to develop respectful feedback through just or fair subcultures and be willing to share concerns, being able to speak up and report what they are learning and discovering, and be a student, become informed because the information is captured and distributed, and recognizing that you can't write a rule for everything that could possibly happen. And begin to look at HRO as a way to implement and integrate great behaviors, but also processes and attitudes and things that really help people to learn and improve. I was invited by Dr. Carleen Roberts to go to Athens, Greece, and work with her there after the Greeks had suffered from incredible wildfires in 2007. 2008, they brought some of the great minds from around the world together, and Carleen was very generous in inviting me to join her on this. We began to talk about things because people were motivated. Over 80 people had died in 2007, a lot of civilians trapped in automobiles as they tried to flee from wildland fires, and we began to talk about their fire departments and how they were organized or disorganized, and how this continuous dysfunctional momentum had just gone on for years, and noticed that even just as recent as last year, they suffered some of the same things because they are struggling to work well together. Began to be invited to other places around the world where people were also interested in high reliability organizing. In the fire community, prescribed fire people were inviting us to come to Sundsvall, Sweden, to join them at their conference and talk about HRO. And on that same trip, I was able to get over to Norway to begin to talk with folks at Statoil. Now I think they're called Equinox. The folks there in that meeting, it was interesting because they wanted to learn about HRO, but first they wanted to tell me about all the things that they were already doing, which took up about 99% of the day. And as I began to talk about HRO, the folks, a safety officer in that group said, "What do we need to give up in order to do HRO?" And they really struggled with the idea that this was a philosophy that underpinned everything that you do, and they were looking at removing and replacing parts. Eventually, they came to understand a lot more about HRO, and Sigmund Hussoy from that organization, the vice president in charge of crisis management, eventually developed a global rapid assistance team based on the incident command system, and distributed and trained people that were all over the world to help and assist where crisis situations might break out in their worldwide organization. We began to work with also the Norwegian Falk Newtek organization. They provided training, and they wanted to improve their initial attack program, which was called Proactive Management Method, and scale it up. Not throw it away, but scale it up to be able to work with others in large size and long duration events using incident management system training, or ICS, incident command system. They didn't like that word command. They wanted to change that. They didn't want it to have that military feel, and they felt that this was directly related to the American approach. And even though it was Wildland Firefighters that originally created the incident command system back in California, Southern California, they wanted to change the name to make it a little bit more comfortable for them to swallow. On that same trip, I was introduced to the folks at Lund University, Dr. Sidney Becker, who was interested in learning more about my interests, and I began to study with him as a graduate researcher with the Leonardo da Vinci Laboratory for Complexity and Systems Thinking, and ended up with a master's in Human Factors and System Safety. The main thing that I was able to do, though, not just getting the degree, but shift my thinking in many ways away from the rules, the processes, the established prescriptions for running an organization, for helping people to learn and improve. And I began to ask people what it was that they felt was most important to learn. And incident commanders, these incident management team commanders, they were telling me that, yeah, we get about 10 to 20% of what we need to know in the classroom through training, through courses of instruction, but 80% or more is actually learned informally. And so this is what I based my thesis on, and began to look at how they described informal learning really helping them and how we might then advance informal learning opportunities. And so using appreciative inquiry, we use a positive approach of asking questions, asking people, what do you think? What was the best experience you ever had? Or how did you come to appreciate what it is that you know today? And they began to say, we all study leadership and we all really have an internal value system and we try to live those values. But we need a safe way to learn. We need psychological safety. So if somebody speaks up, it's not going to be a career-ending event concern. It's more of a let's just share ideas and information and let that flow and be in a mode of inquiry instead of a mode of knowing, already having all the answers. And be humble enough to say maybe we just don't know all the answers. And then become involved with mentoring and coaching people that we could depend upon, our go-to sources, but then also people that we might be able to be helpful to in the area of mentoring and coaching and learning how to do that really well. Through Dr. Decker's book, I began to learn not only about human factors and system safety, I began to learn about the history of our world and how it's evolved and understand how things have changed from what used to be black and white, off and on, bimodal, to now complicated and more often complex, and what that really meant, and began to understand also more about people and the human factor. Some of these books really go into these things, but one of the ones that we really studied quite a bit goes back to my career in the Air Force, working with F-15 jet fighters, and I understood from reading Dr. Scott Snook's book that two F-15s had shot down two Blackhawks filled with UN peacekeepers, and 24 people had died mistakenly because they were under the assumption that they were HIMS and Russian-made aircraft that were the enemy and should not have been in the airspace that they were patrolling. And they were given the green light by an airborne warning system, and they were tried to identify the aircraft, and by racing by them, these fast movers, as they're called, really had a hard time picking out the difference as they were coming from opposite directions, and they turned around and the systems worked, their training worked just like it was supposed to, except they were not the enemy. And Scott Snook went back to the reports that had been done by the Air Force after several years of trying to investigate and find the smoking gun, and he found that poor relationships and assumptions and many other things helped them drift into failure. And actually the pilots were exonerated, and people began to look at a systems approach to failure more than ever before. There were other kinds of books that I was able to get into, and began to discover that the kinds of questions and how we ask them really make a difference. The questions that we wanted to ask were ones that challenged our assumptions, affirmed each other's strengths and gifts, and helped us to reflect on past successful experiences. Appreciative inquiry was a new way of asking good questions, and began to learn that we have a different culture in the U.S. We have a culture of do and tell, and that we really don't value relationship building as much as we value task accomplishment. And the whole idea of get or done really takes precedence over building friendships and relationships and good communication. And I began to see that as I worked with people in other countries, especially over in Europe, and got to know Eric Holnagel and his reading his books on the efficiency, thoroughness, trade-off, first of all, and then later resilience, engineering, and practice. And I began to see how people struggled to succeed. And sometimes things worked out well because they didn't get in a hurry and take the wrong action too quickly, or they didn't wait too long because they wanted to be thorough and they wanted to do such an examination of the situation that they had 99% certainty that they were taking the right course of action, but then the window of opportunity closed and they failed in any case. I began to learn that people in the organizations that I've been associated with, as they studied failure, tried to learn pretty much only from failure, began to talk about how they could not let what had happened the year before or in years past, looking in the rearview mirror at that date and that incident, saying we can't let that happen again, instead of looking out through all of the windows as they drove into the future. People were having a difficult time understanding why we weren't learning from events and preventing things from happening. We needed to change, and we knew it. But we began to look at how we were already in the situation where we were developing programs and tools and putting things out there to manage behaviors, what we could see on the surface, and began to look below the surface at attitudes and belief systems and how these were anchored in our values. You could push on that buoy and you could move it a distance, but then because of its anchor in values, it would come right back to where it was. And we began to see that if we are going to be effective in changing, we need to have a follow-through system. Not just talk about it, but really help whatever it is that we're trying to implement take root and change down at the values level, where people began to see that they needed to adapt their thinking. They needed to look at how they really felt about things and why, and understand why. And so we began to look at high reliability organizing, not just as a process, but as a philosophy. We began to move our organizations, try to transform them from where they were and focused on compliance and being rules-based to really looking at safety as an organizational goal first, because we had had so many firefighters perish in horrible ways. We really wanted to improve our safety program. We began to talk about risk and shared risk and people being vulnerable in many different ways, and also begin to look at process-driven, formalized ways of doing things, but then move on towards continuous improvement and become a learning-based organization and really have a deep understanding, an intuitive feel for what we meant by an HRO philosophy, so that when an incident happened, we didn't go backwards and build more rules and focus more on compliance. We continually moved forward in a way that helped us to learn and improve from one another, and not just focus on the leader, the hero, the guy in the blue boots and the cape that was going to lead us into better decision making. We really began to collaborate and cooperate together. And people began to ask questions, well, aren't there bad apples out there? Yes, there are. Yes, there are. There are people who will experience others' careless disregard for their safety. And those people need to be identified and dealt with administratively. But people 99% of the time are not like that. We began to look at safety in new ways, and we redefined it for ourselves and with the help of others as an ability to succeed under varying conditions, rather than only as the ability to avoid unwanted outcomes like we had in the past. And we began to talk about resilience as not just bouncing back, which is really not very likely anyway to come back to the same place you were, but actually understood it as an intrinsic ability of a system to adjust before, during, and following changes and disturbances, but also as we learn, as our operations helped us to provide information and intelligence about both expected and unexpected conditions. The French firefighters that I was able to continue working with in Marseille helped me to bring HRO and the Incident Command System to Corsica, an island out in the Mediterranean where Renault and I and several others were able to teach them about the Incident Command System, the Incident Management System, as some are calling it now, to help them to get ready for a very special event. The Tour de France was coming to Corsica, the 100th anniversary of the Tour de France, and people were saying, what if we have something really crazy happen here? And I think Renault can help share the story at some point as you have coffee later maybe about how they were glad that they had this training and information to help them take care of things when a bus got stuck underneath the end of the race platform where people were waiting for the bikes to come through, and they changed the end of the race, and then they changed it again, and people were doing interesting things to confuse the bicyclists, and things got crazy. Later, Sidney Decker wrote a book, again, to talk more about competencies that you could build, risk competencies. And people began to talk about safety differently. And these competencies really related to what I was interested in learning more about, where you could not only identify what people already had, but then create safe spaces where people could learn more about what they still needed to do. And you could keep these discussions alive, but they were all focused on the cornerstone of world-class trust. Interesting that this conversation came up with the CCRM call a while ago where I was on, and I was talking with Peter Martelli, and we were saying, you know, I wonder if there's been much written about trust. And sure enough, trust has been written about. Many of you have heard of Stephen Covey. This is his son, Stephen M.R. Covey, that wrote this book, The Speed of Trust. And he said there's one thing that needs to be included in this business formula, strategy times execution equals results. You need to include the variable of trust, because it significantly impacts what kind of results you're going to get. And there were people that had done studies in business and in education, noted here below on this slide, that had come up with information about how you pay a very heavy tax when there's a low trust situation in an organization, but also in personal relationships. And they began to identify what those conditions looked like and how that played out and what kind of results you would get from a very low trust environment. But when you have a world-class trust environment, there's a dividend, a real benefit from cultivating trust within your organization. And he began to describe these things in ways that, wow, I always knew it could be that way or it should be that way. Why isn't it that way? And he began to give very helpful information on how you can build trust, repair trust, and move trust into your organization where it needs to be at this world-class level. Began to continue working in Europe with Dutch firefighters. And one of the great groups that I've been able to work with is on the eastern side of the Netherlands, Enschede and Twente, the fire district there. Leaders I began to work with and talk with them about high reliability organizing, the incident command system, and their system of management of incidents, and also began to introduce what I had begun to learn about relational coordination, and especially as they realized the world had changed with the different events of the 90s and recently and since the turn of the century into a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, a VUCA world. Some of you have probably heard about. There's a lady, Dr. Gittell, that had organized this relational coordination research collaborative that had developed this process where you began to look at how different parts of your organizations, individuals and small units, worked well together or did not, and what they understood about shared goals and shared knowledge and what kind of mutual respect they had with one another. And she began to ask them about the frequency and the timely conversations and how accurate they were and how they perceived things in different ways, and began to do an assessment of how things were and created safe spaces for them to begin to have those difficult, oftentimes, conversations, and implemented things that helped them to assess their current state and identify desired state, and began to look at structural interventions. And some worked well in some places and not as well in others. Again, they could actually see performance outcomes, improvements in quality and safety, client engagement and worker engagement. And people began to see and understand where the disconnects were and how they could improve relationships among the different individuals and small units. As I worked with the Dutch, they showed me what they were doing in creating a risk factory where a military base had once housed aircraft, and said, you know, we need to bring people together to talk about safety from different perspectives. Partners in safety, civilians, businesses, educational institutions, school-age children, adults, seniors. They began to all come together to collaborate on safety innovation, and they built this world-class place that really talks about everything from motor vehicle dangers to dangers of the internet and how kids could be entrapped and ensnared with things that could be dangerous to them and their futures. At the same time, began to look at emotional and social intelligence. People began to say, you know, there's a lot here that can help us to move forward in our leadership competencies if we can just look at where we are and where we're strong and build on those strengths and add to those things that we're good at, other things where maybe we're needing a little bit of improvement. Recently, in addition to Jody Hoffman-Gittell's book on transforming relationships, there's another book that just came out. Dr. Todd Conklin has published The 5 Principles of Human Performance. And this was really helpful to me because I didn't grow up in the nuclear power industry or, you know, didn't serve on nuclear power submarines in the military. And the things that they were learning about HRO from that world, I still had to catch up on. And so these principles, we got a little bit of background noise coming in, I think, but in any case, I'll just press on. These principles talked about how they recognize that error is normal and blame really doesn't fix anything. In fact, it becomes a roadblock. Learning stops when you start blaming. And learning and improving are really vital to an organization's situation, and context influences behavior. How people respond is important as well. And so these 5 principles that came out of the nuclear power industry actually were discussed a lot in many ways, but people like myself had never seen them written down. Currently, I'm working with researchers Jenny Belden Charles out of the Taos Institute, a project for the U.S. Forest Service, a learning module on relational leadership using Appreciative Inquiry, and asking questions like, what have you learned about how people can improve the situations, the conditions where they work, so that people get along better and people overcome the problems of the past, the baggage that they've brought with them, and are able to really help one another? What have you already learned? And begin to capture those things. There's a book out called The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle that we're using as a significant way to help us to look at skills to build safety, and also how to share vulnerability, and also a skill on establishing purpose and moving towards goals that are based on people's values. Daniel Coyle gives a lot of great practical information in that text. The Pre-Accident Investigations podcast recently on February 9th began to bring together ideas from like a panel discussion. Todd Conklin leading that conversation with Bob Edwards, and there were 2 others. Maybe someone will be able to help me remember here in just a minute. Mark Getson and Andrea Baker. The 4 of them sat down in this podcast and said, you know, there are things that we are learning about how organizations change, and where some good starting points are and where some impractical ones are, where people want to jump forward into a solution. And they said, you know, if we can get leadership interested in high reliability organizing and help them to understand human and organizational performance fundamentals, and just begin to develop the language with them so that they can become interested and supportive, then maybe we can begin to bring these fundamentals into other parts of the organization and help them to learn about what they're doing, what their operations are really doing, not just what they're prescribing, the black line of rules and processes, and actually the blue line of how things really are happening, and begin to intercede at places where things needed to change, and begin to look at systems that are already there and begin to align those systems with the new philosophies, and then continuously and collaboratively improve. Working on reliability is not just something that we did that and check that box, but more of something that is dynamic and continues, and using the operational intelligence that we get from operational learning. And as people come and go throughout the organization, help us to really focus on those areas of expertise and appreciate where people have learned a lot over many, many years, but where others are new and say, you know, I came from something that's totally different, and I really need to be brought up to speed here. And so people are beginning to look at things like lessons learned centers. There's one, John, I'm glad to see that you're on the call today. The future is something that is full of possibilities. There's holistic planning that the Global Heritage Consortium for Public Use Planning has said, you know, we can use the Lessons Learned Center to help us to remember what we've done, but then also to help us to come together in a way that we can collaborate and cooperate. And I began to talk with others about this holistic idea. And you know, it's something I find that people like Nesbitt have said in this geography of thought. Westerners just don't do it very well. Asians, Easterners, they have it as part of their DNA almost. They look at things totally different in a much more holistic way, where people in Western cultures tend to create structures and boxes, and that's how you can see things in our hierarchies where we try to break things down into bite-sized pieces, something that's manageable. And holistic planning is something that maybe people in Western societies really struggle with because it's just not part of the way they grew up, where Asians maybe are a little bit more adept and much more likely to use that idea as a natural phenomenon. Also in the future, I hope to continue dialogue and discussion with Belgian and Dutch firefighters. They have talked about building a lessons learned center in Europe for firefighters, structural firefighters. This man in the black shirt on the bottom left side, Peter Mays, he has created a system of instruction for fireground survival using all kinds of ways to help people to build confidence and skills so that they avoid becoming entrapped in buildings and structures where things have collapsed during a fire or emergency situation, and be able to get themselves out of trouble because they've already gone through a lot of training that helped them to develop skills and knowledge about how to avoid and then also escape these Mayday situations. He has talked about a lessons learned program for European firefighters where none currently exists today. Like here in the U.S., we have a lot of things that we've captured in the way of reports that are hidden in desks and on shelves, and others do not get to see because we don't share our dirty laundry. That's the attitude that the Wildland fire community was in 20 years ago. And Peter says that's where we're at today. So this is an area of opportunity. There may be other projects with the Center for Catastrophic Risk Management that you're aware of, but I'm not. And so, again, I hope that somehow I might be able to reconnect with CCRM and be helpful and useful to your organization, your clients, and the ways that you want to move forward into the future.